Alejandro Beutel was a former policy analyst, research and policy analyst at MPAC. He is currently in school, and he is a research specialist with a couple of think tanks. And Alejandro's story is that research in and of itself can help change perceptions, narratives, and tell stories. And I'm going to ask Alejandro to come up and talk to you about what he's done in terms of research. Alejandro?
Thank you, Harris, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here today, and I think it's really befitting that we are having this convention here in this particular house of God, because I think it dovetails very nicely with a quick story that I want to start off to kick into my discussion about research. In about 2 weeks or so, I'm going to be approaching the 10th anniversary of when I had decided to embrace Islam. And what's interesting is that a little bit about my background. Obviously, when you hear my name, you do not automatically think Muslim. You know, it's a little bit, it gives people a little bit of a double take. And so that included my own parents when I told them that I had decided to embrace Islam. And what's interesting in my family is that I am not only half Salvadoran and half Italian, which, by the way, is a very set of passionate cultures under one household, but I also live in a very multi-faith house. And so interfaith issues for me is not just kumbaya, it is about actual family solidarity. My father is Jewish, my mother is Catholic, and me. Welcome to America, right? So, let's segue over into the conversation now, because when I told him that I had decided to become Muslim, my father, who's a very sort of matter-of-fact man, was like, oh, okay, well, don't get involved in any terrorist stuff, and I guess we're okay. Fair enough. All right, Pops. And by the way, stuff, because he's a very matter-of-fact man, was actually a nicer substitute for a four-letter word that he normally uses. My mother, on the other hand, she did not take it as well. She cried for 3 days straight. And in retrospect, it is actually somewhat humorous, and I talk about this occasionally with my mom. And you know, one of the things that I learned in my conversations and that inspired me to get into research in large part was not just because of the spiritual tradition and emphasis on knowledge building within Islam and our religious tradition, but also when I talked to my mother, she said something very interesting. She said, I thought that when you became a Muslim, you decided to abandon your American identity and your Hispanic identity. Okay? And I didn't get offended by that. I thought to myself, wow, that's very interesting. Okay? This is the perception of my mother, who is a very well-educated woman, has traveled throughout Latin America and Europe, art history specialist, really used to be a fashion designer, very sophisticated, cosmopolitan woman. You know, when I think of my mom, I'm like, damn, she's got it together. That's my mama. I love her to death, you know? Really. But when she told me that, I was like, this is interesting. And so rather than getting upset about it, I said, you know what? Let's look into this a little bit more. Because then this is a conversation about talking about sharing our stories, but then looking into this beyond just anecdotes, right? It is about impacting the dinner table conversations among not just your average Joes and Janes, but also the Fatimas and Husseins that are here today, okay? Because it's not just a question of identity and relationships within the broader American society, but also about how we as Muslims, in our diversity, perceive and think of ourselves. So there are two conversations that are going on here. And really, the whole point of research is to avoid what I would call death by anecdote, okay? Death by anecdote in the sense that, you know, well, I heard this from this person, and, you know, our community has, you know, this great thing or has this challenge or whatever. Let's clear the table here for a moment and actually start from a fresh place and work our way towards meaningful research. And this story here, I think, serves as what I would call a small microcosm of trends that is going to lead up to 2050. 2050 is going to be a watershed moment. You guys are probably thinking right now, Alejandro, why are you talking about 2050? It's 2012 right now. You know, mijo, you're going nuts here. Well, not quite. First of all, time flies by really quickly. But second of all, is that 2050, there are already a number of organizations, including think tanks, that are trying to prepare for 2050 because it is going to be a watershed moment. This is going to be the first time since our nation was founded that we are going to be a minority-majority country. We are going to be undergoing profound shifts in culture, demographics, economics, you name it, it's going to happen. And my question that I would pose, especially to my fellow Muslim brothers and sisters is, are we up to the challenge? Do we know ourselves well enough that we can rise to the occasion? And so this is why I'm setting about research here, because I want us to know ourselves and know how we fit into the broader society and do it in a meaningful way. Because throughout our history as a nation, America has basically been one of the major global testing grounds for democracy, okay? And in our current age, especially here in 9/11, we are one of the major laboratory experiments right now in enhancing our pluralism. You know, we're talking about Muslims' rights, but we're also looking at this in the context, especially for me as a Latin American, as issues of immigration as well, and what that means in defining America, defining that narrative. So where do we fit in terms of our faith and as an integral part of this community? So we got to know ourselves first. And that's really, really key. And so the whole point of this is to let the data lead the discussion. Move from the one-dimensional conversations about communities, in this case American Muslims, and look at it much more sort of 3D. Get beyond the terrorism frames and narratives that Wardah had just talked about a moment ago, and really start to look at who we are in a broader fashion. And there's really three aspects to research that I just want to talk about really quickly before I hand it over to the next set of folks here who are going to be absolutely brilliant. The first one is about identification. Research is important because it helps to identify what are the challenges and opportunities that we have, especially within our own communities. Okay? It helps us to identify what are the challenges, but then what are the scope of those challenges too. Let me give you an example of some research that I've been doing at MPAC. We're set to be releasing a report soon that we had done in partnership with Missouri State University. Now, we did all these little sort of fancy tests where we had, over the internet, done a poll with about 800 American Muslim youth, and then did these little kind of neat psychological experiments, again, all over the internet, to test about how well they get themselves civically motivated and activated, and what that relationship is to their identity as Americans and Muslims. And some of the report was heartening in the sense that young American Muslims, 18 to 25, they crave faith and freedom. They crave to be both American and Muslim, and that was reassuring. But one of the things that we also did find, though, that we as a community need to work on is to be more civically active and engaged. We found that amongst the youth, there was high levels of discussing politics at home, but low levels of actually going out and getting engaged and doing the things that Yusuf or Wardah are doing. God bless them because they're setting a precedent and doing the kind of leadership. My job is to be able to make sure that we know where we need to be in terms of taking those next steps. We need to not just talk the talk, we need to do what they're doing, walk the walk. That's key. Beyond identification, then, and I think this goes a lot to the heart of what Wardah was saying, is the second aspect, which is reframing. And I have this gentleman up here for a good reason. Reframing is about trying to reshape and understand the issue in a different way, tackle our challenges or identify our opportunities and boost those opportunities in a different way. And let me take one example here, because I was talking about identity. Lots of times there is a question, though, perhaps within some American Muslim communities, based on our survey, though, that we did identify some youth, though, who did feel like there was a little bit of a tension, though, between their civic and their religious identities. And so one of the things that we are doing now is working on a history paper that is going to be published by MPAC soon, looking at the impact of Islam on the American founding fathers. This gentleman right here is Joe Ben Solomon, who was an African slave, an Islamic scholar who had come over and eventually had gained his freedom. But in the process, though, his story was talked about by people such as Benjamin Franklin. And it's interesting because Wardah had just mentioned before about negative narratives of American Muslims. One of the things that one of the sort of counter narratives that's been out there has been not only that Muslims can be a threat to the society, but that they even have no historical relationship, when nothing could be further from the truth. Even if we look at more modern times, you saw the Geller image of the 9/11 towers falling, and everyone talks about the 19 hijackers. But what about the Bangladeshi American architect who built the Sears Tower in Chicago, Fazlur Rahman Khan? Where is he in that narrative? Where is he in our discussions? Okay? So even things like pop culture and sports. Growing up, you know, I had a lot of friends who liked to call me Ali because they couldn't pronounce my name, Alejandro. So they liked to shorten my name. Move like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Muhammad Ali, rope-a-dope. He was one of the best boxers of all time, if not the, well, he really was the greatest. So that sort of thing, you know, that is a way of reframing. And then finally, just one last thing I want to talk about before I conclude here, which is it's not just about identifying and reframing, it is then stepping up to the plate and making solutions. This paper here is Building Bridges to Strengthen America. We had just heard about the Peter King hearings, and he talked about, in his hearings, making claims that there are too many mosques in America, and not only that, but on the question of terrorism, which unfortunately is the thing that bedevils the conversation around American Muslims, is, oh, American Muslims don't cooperate enough with law enforcement. Actually, that's not true. Au contraire, Representative King. What we had found when we had done our study of Al-Qaeda plots since 9/11 was that 2 out of every 5 of those terrorist plots have been foiled with the assistance of Muslim communities. And when we broke down the data further, what we found is that 1 out of every 3 homegrown plots have been foiled with the assistance of a Muslim. Because when we saw something, we said something. This is our country. We belong here. We want to be here. We don't want anyone to take it away from us. And the proof is in the pudding. And we're here to have those solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro, for sharing that narrative with us.